Hi, good morning everyone. My name is Ruth Smith. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow based here at the University of Leeds. I'm presenting today on behalf of my team on the topic of whose empowerment counts, gendered power, market interventions and development scenarios in Tanzania and Malawi. This research is based on preliminary findings from the Foster Health Project, which stands for Food Systems Transformation in Southern Africa for One Health. This is a Horizon-funded project, which is also working across Zambia and South Africa, and we have partners across those countries, but today I'm going to be presenting on work from Tanzania and Malawi, which was also conducted in collaboration with CARE International and Check Globe, and in-country support from Tanzania and Malawi. So I'm first going to give a bit of a background to the study, which is based on understandings and lived experiences of women's empowerment and a critique of how it's often conceptualised and operationalised within development interventions. So efforts to promote women's economic empowerment through integrating women more into market structures have become quite central to development policy and practice. And within this we see things like entrepreneurship training, microcredit interventions, and these have emerged as a solution to the lack of savings and access to credit, which often limit women's entrepreneurship activity within low-income countries. In interventions such as farmer field business schools or village saving and loans associations are often promoted as a kind of vehicle for women in order to access those finance and skills. So when unpacking the assumptions that underpin the kind of theories of change of these projects in terms of who gets to decide what empowerment looks like, what it means, a common assumption which underpins this is that integrating women more into market-orientated commodity value chains is going to enhance their financial independence, and then that assumed increase in capital will be reinvested into household well-being and community well-being. Our research takes this as the starting point to kind of unpack these assumptions and to explore what are women's lived experiences of these interventions. And this is important in the context of scenarios and hypothetical climate futures, which we're discussing in this conference, because these assumptions have significant implications for how equitable development futures are imagined and evaluated. So when it comes to the monitoring and evaluation of such interventions, we often see empowerment reduced and simplified into quantifiable indicators. So this paper here by Watkins outlines 3 ways in which project impact is often demonstrated, so through counting activities and participants, providing testimonials and narratives of change around kind of success stories, and also hiring consultants to write reports describing the project's success. And this is partly a result of a rise in results-based funding and accountability to donors and the pressure that NGOs are under in order to kind of demonstrate impact to those donors. And in terms of women's economic empowerment interventions, we see the kind of impact assessments focusing more on outcomes alone, so looking at the number of women who are trained, the number of women who access loans, rather than what they did with that training or with the loans. So based on this background information, we have 3 research questions to explore today. The first being, what are rural Tanzanian and Malawian women's lived experiences of these kind of development interventions? What are some of the unintended consequences of these interventions, and if and how are they captured by development organisations? And finally, what do these findings suggest about how women's empowerment is experienced in such contexts? So for the methodological approach, we took a qualitative exploration of women's lived experiences within context of these kind of development interventions. We took a multi-method approach to data collection, so we used oral history interviews, which is on the image on the left here, which shows kind of the co-constructed timelines, physical timelines, which we put together with participants. We also used semi-structured interviews, focus group discussions, and also photo voice, of which this image on the right here. And that's a kind of creative, participatory storytelling method through which small groups of participants shared stories about their everyday lives through photographs that they had taken themselves. In terms of sampling, we sampled across men and women, different ages, but also participation in groups, in the interventions, and also non-participants as well. We used thematic coding, so we're just going to go through some of the themes that came out through the analysis today. But firstly, a little bit of background to the case study context. So we're drawing on data from Tanzania and Malawi here. Of course, there's some differences in those contexts, but there are lots of commonalities which underpin the theories of change of the interventions in which we worked alongside. So in both policy frameworks, women's participation in market activities is often framed as a pathway to empowerment and as a strategy for rural development. So we worked alongside 2 USAID-funded projects. In Tanzania, we identified 4 different types of groups through which women access loans. The first being Village Saving Loans Associations. Second, loans provided to groups of women which were organised by the development organisations. The third is self-formed groups in order to access loans from the district governments. And finally from financial institutions. So I should just mention that in Tanzania there is a local government policy that provides 10% of local revenue to disadvantaged groups, and these can be women, youth or disabled. In Malawi we worked alongside the Care Tichikulani project, which was also funded by USAID, and this promoted the Farmer Field Business School model, which trained female smallholder farmers in business and entrepreneurship skills, and also facilitated loans through VSLAs as well. So onto the themes. The first theme which we'll discuss is around transactional empowerment. So based on our analysis, women's empowerment in these contexts was often largely understood as contingent on membership in formal groups. So these quotes here can demonstrate that the perception that you need to be in a group in order to access empowerment. Empowerment here kind of becomes more of a transactional, tangible product whereby women perceive empowerment, which is packaged as access to financial services like loans. We found that this often privileged certain types of women who were able to participate regularly or who had male support. And on the flip side, it often left those who were not successful in obtaining such loans feeling quite disempowered, because not all women were able to join groups, and often the processes to access these loans can be really lengthy and complicated as well. In Malawi, we also found that some forms of empowerment were also enacted outside of these formal structures. So women who were not involved in the development interventions were still reporting on things like self-worth and increased income and economic resilience by leveraging informal networks. Second theme is around empowerment being quite contextual. So in addition to an increased income and agency, respondents also described empowerment as the ability to respond to urgent needs, to adapt in crisis, to kind of sustain livelihoods and also provide for their families. Often women talked about wanting to send their children to school. So for the loans, this led to a bit of a problem sometimes, because after the 3-month grace period, women had to begin repayments. But of course, using the money to send your children to school doesn't really provide those quick returns on investment that would normally enable women to start repaying the loans under those conditions. So this often led to lots of cases of difficulties and defaulting on loan repayments. And this exposes quite a disconnect between kind of goals and values of empowerment from the perspective of the women versus how empowerment is kind of operationalized within these interventions, because those often treat these kind of deviations from project goals as a kind of failure. So the women were often penalized for not using the money as intended for business activities. Our third theme is around empowerment as a kind of collective process. So the women who had joined groups often valued the more communal aspect of empowerment, as these quotes show here, kind of learning from older women, receiving advice, and the emotional support that you get through those networks. And this suggests that empowerment should also be seen, or more be seen, as kind of relational. So whilst Western models of empowerment might often emphasise independence, our data suggests that women experience empowerment through their relationships, not kind of in opposition to them. Our fourth theme was around trust and risk aversion. So our Tanzania data highlighted the legacy of previous group failure and collapse. So these quotes here kind of demonstrate how cases in the past where respondents had engaged in development interventions and had lost money. And this has often resulted in a kind of general distrust towards financial institutions and development organisations, particularly among rural women, as this quote here demonstrates, kind of not wanting to be conned out of their money or for their money to go down the drain. In Malawi, we often found that this distrust was not only directed towards the financial institutions, but it also went beyond that. So women were quite fearful of what would happen if they failed, what would happen to their kind of social standing within households and communities if things went wrong. Theme 5 is around patriarchal gatekeeping of resources. So multiple respondents, both men and women, often cited that women would need their husband's permission in order to access loans or participate in these interventions. And these often led to concerns around husbands forbidding their wives in order to participate, as outlined by this quote here. Some women were also quite reluctant to join groups or to take the loans for fear that their husbands would then take control over the expenditure of those. Again, this quote here is just a woman reflecting on her friend who took a loan, and her husband then took control of that and the woman was left to repay. So this theme also suggests that providing women with microfinance might not always lead to an increase in women's control over that income. And the final theme that we have to discuss today is leads on from that, around marital and community relationship breakdown. So these kind of strict and sometimes weekly loan repayments often imposed a lot of stress and risk on respondents, especially when business ventures failed or they didn't have control over the expenditure. In cases of defaulting, there were lots of reports of assets being seized, and this can range from mattresses through to roof materials. And this often, of course, led to quite a lot of social stigma and affected relationships within the community. In many cases, women were often left to repay the loan or risk having their assets seized and even going to jail. So a quote here from a woman who was worried about her husband leaving her if she took a loan and wasn't able to repay. I should note that this was more frequently reported in cases of loans from financial institutions rather than VSLAs, which had a bit more of an aggressive kind of repayment structure. So when we come to the discussion, going back to the research questions, the first around women's lived experiences of such interventions. While women's inclusion in savings groups or kind of the receipt of loans is often reported as evidence of empowerment by these development organisations, this framing often kind of obscures the gender dynamics which can mediate their ability to benefit from such opportunities. Our findings suggest that empowerment is not a predictable byproduct of financial inclusion, but rather it's a kind of contingent process which is shaped by these gender and social structures. This underscores a core limitation within the theories of change of many microfinance interventions. This assumption that women's increased access to resources is going to translate into increased agency without really accounting for intra-household power dynamics. Our second research question was around unintended consequences. So women having their assets seized, household and community relationship breakdown and the social stigma that often comes with this. Our findings highlighted the range of unintended and often quite disempowering consequences which is associated with such interventions. And this underlies as well the danger of evaluating empowerment solely through kind of access metrics such as participation and loan uptake, which can produce quite misleading indicators without really following the kind of outcomes of those interventions. The third research question, which is around local experiences and values of empowerment. So rather than being a kind of individualised or static state, empowerment in our findings was more relational, so it was experienced kind of through social learning, emotional support, kind of shared goals within groups. Respondent understandings of empowerment and the value placed on the ability to sustain families reveals how empowerment is enacted through quite context-specific decisions grounded in care and kind of intergenerational responsibility. These findings also challenge the dominant M&E logics that equate empowerment with entrepreneurial outputs alone. So just to summarise quickly, in women's economic empowerment interventions, empowerment is often treated as a kind of a deliverable or like an end state which is achieved when women accesses credit or starts a business. But our study underscores the importance for development frameworks to recognise and value women's agency beyond simple market participation. So looking at what women did with the loans or the training, or how did gender relations shape their experiences. Our findings also suggest that in reality, empowerment is often quite contextual and relational. So even when women did gain access to resources, without community level shifts, that access doesn't always equate to actual agency. And the values placed on collective learning and peer networks suggest that empowerment becomes a bit more deeply rooted and more sustainable when it's supported and affirmed by the community. So thank you very much. I have a list of references here for further reading, and thank you very much for listening, and I'll be around to answer any questions at the end.